Most people think being broke means having no income. That is not what I have seen. Being broke in the way that actually damages a life is much subtler than that. It is not bankrupt broke. It is not sleeping. In the car broke, it is not the kind of broke that announces itself loudly enough for the world to feel sorry for you. It is the much more profitable kind of broke. The kind where you still have a paycheck, you still look normal from the outside, you still go to work, you still pay most of your bills, you still function well enough for the system to keep using you. But inside that outwardly ordinary life, every month is a tightrope. Gas has to be timed, groceries have to be calculated, the bill gets stared at before it gets paid. The checking account becomes a weather report. The calendar starts ruling your emotions because payday is not just payday anymore, it is relief. That is the kind of broke I have watched for years. And I want to tell you something very clearly. That kind of broke is not an accident the financial system hates. It is the condition the financial system knows how to monetize. Your bank does not need you destroyed. Destroyed customers are messy. Destroyed customers miss payments, default, create losses, and disappear. That is not ideal. What a bank really likes is something much cleaner. It likes you just stressed enough to need help, just thin enough to pay fees, just anxious enough to borrow badly, just exposed enough that convenience outranks judgment, just broke enough to stay profitable. That is why I want to talk about one number that almost nobody treats with the seriousness it deserves. $20,000, not $1 million, not $500,000, not the kind of number that gets finance channels excited, just $20,000 sitting in reserve. I do not mean in fantasy. I mean real cash or cash equivalents that can be reached without drama. That number changes a life more than most people understand. And the reason it changes a life is not because $20,000 makes you rich. It does not. It changes your life because it moves you across an invisible line. Below that line, money controls your nervous system. Above that line, you begin recovering the right to think. That is not poetry. That is economics mixed with psychology. And psychology matters because the way a person feels around money affects almost every major decision he makes. The public likes to talk about net worth as if financial life were a static scoreboard. I have never seen it that way. I see structure. I see whether the household has room. I see whether an emergency is an inconvenience or a catastrophe. I see whether a person can say no. I see whether he can wait. I see whether he has become expensive prey for institutions that profit from his thin margin. That is why $20,000 matters so much. Let me paint you a picture of life below it. A person below that line is almost always doing mental arithmetic in the background. Can I fill the tank and still cover the grocery trip? Should I pay this bill now or let it sit 3 more days? What if the dentist bill arrives this week? What if the child gets sick? What if the brake light becomes a brake job? What if the refrigerator starts making that sound again? What if the job becomes unstable? What if the hours get cut? What if the rent rises? This is not dramatic poverty in the old cinematic sense. This is something more modern and in some ways more exhausting. It is permanent low-grade exposure. It is life lived with too little buffer. That kind of life costs more than people realize. It costs interest. Of course, it costs fees, it costs late charges, it costs bad loans, it costs bad timing, but more than all that, it costs judgment. A person living below that threshold rarely gets to use his full intelligence because too much of that intelligence is being spent on keeping the next problem from becoming larger than it needs to be. That is what scarcity does. Scarcity narrows the mind. Scarcity makes today feel louder than tomorrow. Scarcity makes the expensive short-term solution look reasonable because the cheap long-term solution requires patience you no longer feel rich enough to afford. And once that happens, the system begins feeding on your condition. That is why I say the bank prefers you this way. Let us start with overdraft fees because they are one of the purest examples of the system charging you for weakness. A household living close to zero is not one surprise away from stress. It is often one badly timed autopay away from being penalized for having no room. The debit card clears. The bill hits before the paycheck lands. The utility draft comes a day early. A small negative balance appears. Then the bank takes $35 or something like it. Not because it provided extraordinary value, but because your margin was too thin to protect yourself. And that $35 is not just $35, it is groceries, it is gas. It is part of the next bill It is emotional proof that you are 1 inch away from the edge. Now imagine the same life with $20,000 in reserve. The checking account does not live on fumes anymore. There is a real backstop. A badly timed draft is no longer a personal insult from the financial system. It is absorbed. That fee never happens. The bank loses a revenue opportunity. You gain something much more valuable than $35. You gain quiet. That quiet compounds. Then there is credit card interest. People speak about credit cards as if the card itself were the problem. It is not. The problem is what the card becomes in the absence of cash reserves below the $20,000 threshold. A credit card stops being a convenience and starts becoming an emergency fund with a knife in it. The bill arrives, the full amount cannot be paid, the balance rolls, the interest begins, and now every month contains an invisible tax on your prior vulnerability. That is exactly the sort of customer the system loves, not the person who uses the card for points and pays it in full. That person is sometimes called a deadbeat inside the industry because he uses the product without donating enough to the machine. No, the profitable customer is the one who keeps a balance alive because life never quite leaves him enough room to kill it. He is paying for past emergencies with future labor. That is a very durable business model if you are the bank. It is a miserable one if you are the household. With $20,000, the emergency no longer has to go on the card. You can fix the car and still sleep. You can cover the medical bill and still breathe. You can float the month without signing away next month. That changes your relationship with the card entirely. Now you are the one extracting convenience, fraud protection, maybe rewards. The bank is no longer extracting desperation. That is a major shift. Then come the desperation products. This is where the whole system becomes almost insulting in its clarity. If a person has no reserve and needs money immediately, he is no longer shopping for capital. He is begging for it. And begging is expensive. That is where the high-interest personal loan appears. That is where the payday structure appears. That is where title loans, cash advances, emergency financing, buy, now pay, ladder chains, and all the other polished traps show up, wearing practical language. The desperate borrower is the ideal borrower because he has lost the right to wait. Once you cannot wait, terms are no longer negotiated from strength. They are accepted from fear. $20,000 destroys that part of the bank's business model. Not because it makes you wealthy, but because it removes your desperation from the market. A desperate person overpays. A liquid person pauses. That pause alone can save years of damage. There is another category banks love and almost nobody notices because it hides behind convenience. Account fees, maintenance fees, minimum balance fees, paper statement fees, inactivity fees, tiny little extractions that are easy to ignore when you look at them one by one and glaringly obvious when you add them up across years of thin balance living. It is astonishing how much the financial system can extract from people without ever clearly looking evil. That is one reason I respect arithmetic more than branding. Arithmetic tells the truth. If you are paying $15 a month for the privilege of storing money in a place that also lends your deposits out profitably for its own benefit, then the arrangement deserves more skepticism than most people give it. Again, a $20,000 buffer changes the structure. You clear the minimums, you avoid the tiny constant penalties, you stop being the sort of customer who is profitable because he has too little room to object. And then there is the least discussed cost of living below the threshold. Emotional mispricing. A stressed person buys badly. He chooses speed over price. He chooses monthly payment over total cost. He chooses immediate relief over long-term advantage. He chooses the poor apartment quickly because the lease renewal clock is ticking. He chooses the overpriced used car because he cannot afford 2 weeks without transportation. He chooses the weak job because he cannot withstand one more month of searching. He accepts the insulting salary because the checking account does not permit principal. People talk about financial security as though it were merely about not panicking in emergencies. Financial security is negotiating power. It is the right to say no, the right to wait, the right to compare, the right to think, the right to leave. That is why $20,000 changes so much. It is not the number itself that matters. It is what the number buys in behavior. A person at zero savings lives under a different set of rules than a person with $20,000 in reserve. The first person lives with scarcity brain. The second begins, perhaps for the first time, to taste something like abundance brain. I do not mean abundance in the ridiculous language of self-help posters. I mean simple breathing room, enough room that every decision is not a referendum on survival. A person with scarcity brain cannot easily optimize his life because optimization requires excess bandwidth. Scarcity brain is always solving today's emergency. Which bill first? Which payment late? Which corner cut? Which pain delayed? That mind may be intelligent. It simply has too much of its intelligence devoted to tactical defense. Abundance brain is not about luxury. It is about spacing. The spacing between stimulus and response grows larger. Something unexpected happens and you do not immediately feel your pulse in your throat. The car repair does not automatically mean debt. The job loss does not automatically mean collapse. The bad boss does not automatically mean silent obedience. That last one matters more than many people realize. I have seen people live under absolutely poisonous managers, not because they lack courage, but because their bank balance made courage financially unaffordable. That is one of the ugliest forms of invisible dependence in modern life. The boss senses it, the employee senses it. The whole relationship becomes warped by the fact that one party can withstand the disruption and the other cannot. Now imagine the same household with $20,000 set aside. Not infinite wealth, not retirement money, not some exaggerated fantasy. Just enough runway to know that if this job becomes unbearable, there is time to leave without immediate ruin. The boss's leverage drops. Your ability to negotiate rises. Your standards can return. That is not a small difference. It changes the texture of your whole life. The same is true when buying a car. The same is true when renting an apartment. The same is true when negotiating a salary. The same is true when deciding whether to start a side business, whether to switch industries, whether to invest in a course that could improve earning power, whether to leave a relationship that is financially entangled with you for the wrong reasons. People think savings is passive. It is not passive at all. Savings is stored freedom. That is why the first $20,000 matters so disproportionately. Below it, life is largely defensive. Above it, offense becomes possible. And this is also why the bank dislikes that threshold. It does not hate you personally. Institutions do not need emotion to exploit structure. They simply profit from certain customer conditions. The person below the threshold is ideal. He is fee-bearing. He is interest-bearing. He is time-constrained. He is emotionally pliable. He is less likely to shop around. He is less likely to walk away. He is less likely to negotiate. He is more likely to finance. He is more likely to miss. He is more likely to pay simply because he has no room left to make a better decision. That is an excellent customer from the institution. Perspective, then one day that same person gets to 20,000 and suddenly he stops bleeding in all the easy places. No overdraft, no revolving emergency credit card balance, no stupid account fees, no payday products, no panic purchases, no urgent surrender to bad terms. He becomes harder to monetize. That is the real shift from profitable customer to increasingly independent customer. Now let me say something that many people do not want to hear. $20,000 may sound impossible to someone starting from zero. Fine, $1 million sounds impossible to most people starting from zero too, which is one reason discussing $1 million is often a worthless exercise. People cannot act on distances they cannot emotionally map. But 20,000 is not magic. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic can be walked. Slowly, yes, messily, yes, but walked. If a person can save $100 a month, he has begun. If he can save $300, the process accelerates. If he can redirect a tax refund, a bonus, a side income stream, or a recurring expense that was never doing much for him. Anyway, the process moves faster still. The point is not speed at first. The point is direction. People underestimate what consistent motion does because they are addicted to cinematic change. Real financial change usually looks extremely boring in the beginning. You cut something, you automate something, you redirect something, you repeat. That is how thresholds are crossed. Now, I want to talk about why most people do not reach the threshold even when the math says they should eventually get there. It is not always low income. Sometimes it is. That should be acknowledged. Honestly, there are millions of people for whom the problem is not latte spending or weak discipline or oversubscription to streaming services. The problem is that wages, rent, health care, child care, transportation, and ordinary life have formed an ugly ratio that is real. But many people with enough income to build the threshold still fail to build it because they misunderstand what the first savings goal is for. They think savings is leftovers. Wrong, savings is infrastructure. Leftovers happen after infrastructure is funded. This is the single most useful mental shift a household can make. The reserve is not what happens if the month goes well. The reserve is one of the fixed obligations of the month. It is as real as rent, as real as utilities, as real as insurance, as real as food. If you wait to see what is left at the end, you are telling your entire spending system that the future can take what the present does not want. The future will always lose that negotiation. It has no voice. That is why automation matters. People like to talk about discipline as if the highest form of discipline is feeling strong enough each month to make the right choice manually. That is nonsense. The best discipline removes the repeated need to feel strong. It reduces heroism. If $100 or $200 or $400 moves out of checking into savings the same day the paycheck arrives, then the household is not negotiating with temptation every month. It is obeying structure. That is far superior. Structure beats intention every time. Then there is the matter of windfalls. This is where households tell the truth about themselves. Tax refund, bonus gift, side hustle spike, cash from selling something. If every windfall gets translated immediately into consumption, then the household is not trying to build a threshold. It is trying to keep ordinary life emotionally upgraded. That is a different goal. You cannot build a wall if every time the bricks arrive you turn them into patio furniture. A person serious about the first 20,000 should treat windfalls as accelerants, not because pleasure is forbidden, because thresholds matter more than pleasures in the early stage. Once you cross the threshold, life itself becomes easier in ways that produce more room for later pleasure. That is the irony the impatient person misses. He spends the accelerant because he wants relief. Now the patient person throws the accelerant on the threshold, gets over it sooner, and then lives with a lower baseline of fear for years after. Which life is better? The answer is obvious to anyone who has lived both. Now let us be very concrete. Suppose a person can save $400 a month. That is $4,800 a year. Without windfalls, he gets to $20,000 in a little over 4 years. That sounds slow only to someone who still thinks in moods instead of in years. 4 years will pass no matter what. The question is not whether 4 years is a long time. The question is what sort of person arrives on the other side of those 4 years. The person who saved nothing arrives older and still exposed. The person who built 20,000 arrives with an entirely different nervous system. Again, not because the amount is huge in absolute terms, because the structure is huge in practical terms. And if the person gets a tax refund, a raise, cuts one real expense, or adds a small side income stream along the way, the journey compresses faster than he imagined. That is another thing the public gets wrong. Once savings begins, it often develops momentum because the identity changes. At first, a person is trying to save. Later, he becomes a person who saves. That is a powerful transition. Identity is one of the most underrated compounding forces in personal finance. A man who thinks of himself as someone always scrambling will keep scrambling. A man who begins to think of himself as a builder starts making builder decisions in other places too. He shops differently, negotiates differently, thinks differently, tolerates less nonsense from banks, bosses, salesmen, and marketers. That is why I say 20,000 changes more than the statement balance. It begins changing the self. Once you stop feeling hunted by every little financial shock, your whole relationship to the future changes. You begin seeing opportunities where earlier you saw only risk. You become able to make a slightly lower paying move with higher upside, because you are no longer chained to this week's survival. You can leave the toxic workplace. You can hold out for the better apartment deal. You can say no to financing gimmicks. You can pay cash for an emergency without beginning another year of interest servitude. That is the hidden yield on the first real reserve. Its stated interest rate may be modest. Its life return is extraordinary. Now let me tell you what happens after 20,000, because people sometimes misunderstand this too. They think I am saying stop there. Of course not. 20,000 is not the finish line. It is the first line that matters below it. The system is feeding on you too easily above it. you begin forcing the system to negotiate differently. After that, the next game begins. Now some money can move toward longer-term investing. Now the reserve can be protected and perhaps eventually enlarged based on household needs. Now retirement contributions become less likely to be interrupted. Now broad index funds or other productive ownership have a chance to remain untouched through emergencies because the reserve is absorbing what used to go on the card. That is where the offensive phase really starts. But offense without a reserve is often fake offense. It looks brave. It is usually brittle. That is why I insist the first 20,000 is so important. It is the moment when the household stops being an easy target and starts becoming a real financial actor. So if you are below that line now, I do not want you romanticizing the distance. I want you identifying the gap, what can actually move each month, what can be cut once and never missed, what windfalls can be redirected, what subscription, habit, convenience, or status purchase is being preserved at the cost of your future quiet. That is the question. Because no bank executive is sitting around hoping you become structurally strong. Why would he? His business model does not need your collapse, but it certainly does not benefit from your independence. Your independence must be purchased by you, $1 at a time if necessary. And if that sounds severe, remember the alternative. The alternative is not comfort. The alternative is remaining exactly profitable enough for everyone except yourself. Fees take a little interest, takes a little panic, takes a little bad timing, takes a little stress, takes a little weak negotiation, takes a little. And over a lifetime, those little extractions become an entire life story that feels strangely smaller than the income alone should have produced. That is what the first 20,000 interrupts. It does not make you rich. It makes you harder to exploit for many people. That is the first real financial victory. And it matters more than almost anything you can buy with the money you are tempted to spend before you get there. So yes, your bank wants you broke, not ruined, not gone, just thin enough to keep generating revenue. The moment you reach 20,000, the arrangement changes. Your emergencies become less profitable for them. Your fear becomes less useful to them. Your impatience becomes less easy to tax. Your options expand. Their leverage over your daily life shrinks. That is why I think the first 20,000 is one of the most meaningful numbers in personal finance. Not because it solves everything, because it changes the game. And once the game changes, you finally have a chance to start playing it on your terms instead of theirs.